It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Susan Winters laughed as she handed Rachel Winters's name card to a server in front of the gala. The gesture was casual, almost elegant, as if she were merely clearing away a piece of stray litter rather than erasing her daughter's place at the family's 25th anniversary celebration. "There must have been a mistake with the seating chart. Darling," Susan said, her voice carrying easily to the nearby tables where the city's elite sat draped in silk and diamonds. She didn't look at Rachel. Instead, she adjusted the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, the stones catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "The main table is quite full. I'm sure you can find a spot near the kitchen with the auxiliary staff. They've laid out a lovely buffet for the workers." Rachel stood perfectly still. The scent of 1,000 white lilies, cloying and sweet, seemed to thicken in the air. She felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her, the judgment of her parents' social circle, people who had watched her be systematically pushed to the margins for years. Richard Winters didn't even look up from his conversation with a local judge. He swirled a glass of amber scotch, the ice clinking a rhythmic, dismissive beat. He was the picture of a successful patriarch, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his suit costing more than Rachel made in 3 months at the design firm. "Don't make a scene, Rachel," Richard said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Your mother worked hard on this event. If you can't be a team player for the family brand, you shouldn't have come." "I'm the one who designed the programs for this event, Dad," Rachel said. Her voice was quiet, a stark contrast to the performative boisterousness of the room. "I spent 30 hours on the layout for free because you said the family needed to save on overhead." David Winters, sitting to his father's right, let out a sharp, mocking snort. He was the golden child, the one whose face graced the firm's brochures while Rachel was kept in the windowless basement office. He leaned back, his hand resting on the shoulder of his fiancée, who looked at Rachel with a mixture of pity and boredom. "It's just a few brochures, Ratch," David said. "Hardly a contribution to the Winters legacy. Why don't you go find that buffet? I hear the shrimp is decent." The exclusion was a familiar ache, a coldness she had lived with since she was a child. She was the modest one, the practical one, the daughter they used for labor but hid from the light. She looked down at her dress, a simple navy wrap she'd found on sale. It felt thin and cheap against the backdrop of the velvet-draped ballroom. She turned away, her heels clicking softly on the polished marble. She didn't head for the kitchen. Instead, she walked toward the tall glass doors that led to the veranda, the cool night air a welcome relief from the suffocating perfume of the ballroom. As she stepped into the shadows, her phone vibrated in her clutch. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't expected to see, Mr. Patterson. She answered on the second ring. "Hello." "Rachel." The voice of Grandma Dorothy's longtime attorney was crisp and formal, yet underpinned by a strange urgency. "I've been trying to reach you. I know the gala is tonight, but this couldn't wait. The final audit of your grandmother's private holdings is complete." Rachel leaned against the stone balustrade, looking back through the glass at her family. They were laughing now, Susan leaning in to whisper something to a socialite who glanced toward the veranda and smirked. "And?" Rachel asked, her heart beginning to thud against her ribs. Dorothy was far more than a silent partner in the family firm, Rachel. She was the majority shareholder of the holding company that owns the Winters estate, the firm's headquarters, and even the very club you're standing in tonight. And according to her ironclad instructions, as of 4 p.m. this afternoon, all of it has been transferred to you. Rachel froze. She watched her mother raise a glass of vintage champagne, the light reflecting off the bubbles. Susan looked triumphant, the queen of a castle she didn't realize was built on sand. "Everything," Rachel whispered. "Everything," Mr. Patterson confirmed. "The house, the cars, the commercial leases. Your parents have been living on a discretionary fund Dorothy provided. That fund has been frozen. You are now the sole executrix and owner. They don't own the chairs they're sitting on, Rachel." Rachel felt a strange, cold, calm wash over her. It wasn't the heat of anger, but the stillness of a predator that had finally found its opening. She reached into her bag and touched the small, silver locket Grandma Dorothy had given her years ago. Inside was a tiny key, the key to a safe deposit box she had never opened. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "I have the documents ready for your signature," Patterson said. "Once you sign, we can begin the transition. You have the power to vacate the premises immediately if you wish." Rachel looked back at the table. Her father was laughing at one of David's jokes, his hand draped over the back of the chair that should have been hers. They had spent 25 years making her feel small, making her feel like a guest in her own life. "No," Rachel said, her voice like whetted steel. "Not tonight. Let them enjoy their party. I want them to feel exactly as powerful as they think they are for just a little longer." And then, Rachel watched as a server approached her mother, and Susan waved him away with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "And then," Rachel said, "I'm going to show them what happens when the help decides to renovate the house." She hung up the phone and tucked it back into her bag. She didn't go back inside. She walked down the stone steps toward the parking lot, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. The gala would continue for hours, a celebration of a legacy that had already vanished. She reached her modest sedan and sat in the driver's seat, the silence of the car a stark contrast to the music fading behind her. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. They were steady. Tomorrow, the locks would change. Tomorrow, the bank accounts would go dark. Tomorrow, the Winters family would find out that the daughter they had discarded was the only thing standing between them and the street. Rachel started the engine. She had a meeting with a lawyer at dawn, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't worried about the seating chart. She was the one who owned the table. The next morning, the sun bled through the heavy velvet curtains of Mr. Patterson's office, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany desk. Rachel Winters sat perfectly still, her fingers tracing the embossed seal on the leather folder in her lap. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco, a fragrance that had always defined Grandma Dorothy's private study. Mr. Patterson leaned forward, his spectacles catching the light as he slid a single, notarized document toward her. "Everything is in order, Rachel," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The deed to the estate, the offshore holdings, and the primary commercial accounts. She bypassed your parents entirely. Legally, you became the sole owner of the Winters legacy the moment the clock struck midnight." Rachel felt a cold, sharp surge of satisfaction. She thought of the wine stain on her dress from the night before and the way her mother had laughed. "They have no idea, do they?" "None," Mr. Patterson confirmed, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "They've spent the morning calling my office, demanding to know when the inheritance will be wired to their joint account. I told them we would discuss everything after the memorial service." "Not yet," Rachel whispered, closing the folder. "Let them have their performance today. They've practiced their grief for years. It would be a shame to interrupt the show." 2 hours later, the humidity at the Oakwood Cemetery was thick enough to choke. Rachel stood at the very back of the gathering, her simple, off-the-rack black dress, a stark contrast to the custom-tailored mourning veils and designer suits worn by Susan and Richard Winters. Her parents stood at the head of the grave, clutching silk handkerchiefs, and receiving condolences from the city's elite as if they were royalty receiving tribute. Susan spotted her daughter through the crowd, and the practiced mask of grief on her face momentarily slipped, replaced by a flash of pure venom. She marched over, her stiletto heels sinking into the soft, manicured turf with every aggressive step. "What are you doing here, Rachel?" Susan hissed, her voice a sharp blade wrapped in a whisper. "I thought I made it clear after your little stunt at the gala. You aren't wanted here. You're an eyesore." "She was my grandmother, too, Susan," Rachel said, her voice level and terrifyingly calm. Richard stepped up beside his wife, his face flushed with the kind of performative anger he usually reserved for waiters and junior associates. "You're an embarrassment to this family. Look at you, dressed like a waitress at a wake. People are whispering, Rachel. David, tell your sister to leave before she ruins the press photos." David Winters didn't even look up from his phone. He stood a few paces back, adjusting his gold cufflinks, his voice dripping with a casual, bored cruelty. "Just go, Rachel. You're making Mom's blood pressure spike, and we have the reception at the estate to prepare for. It's a private event, for family and people who actually matter." Susan leaned in closer, the cloying, suffocating scent of her expensive lily perfume filling Rachel's lungs. "And don't think we haven't noticed that old sedan you parked in the VIP lot. Richard and I have decided that since you're clearly struggling to maintain a basic image, we're taking back the car we lent you. We'll have it towed this afternoon. Consider it a lesson in humility." Rachel almost laughed. She had bought that car with 3 years of saved commissions and missed lunches. "You're seizing my car at a funeral. It's our name on the insurance, isn't it?" Richard snapped, loud enough for several socialites to turn and stare. "Maybe a bus pass will teach you how to speak to your betters. Now, get out of our sight before I have security escort you to the gate." Rachel felt the weight of the silver key in her pocket, not to the car, but to the front door of the very mansion they were planning to use for their victory party. She looked at the crowd, the witnesses to her parents' public cruelty, and felt a strange, icy peace settle over her. She turned away without another word, walking toward the cemetery gates where Sarah was waiting in the shadows of a willow tree. Sarah held a small digital recorder, her face pale. "I got every single word," Sarah whispered. "The insults, the car, all of it." "Good," Rachel said, checking her watch. The sun was beginning to hit its peak, glinting off the polished marble of the headstones. "Let them enjoy the estate tonight. Let them drink the expensive champagne and tell everyone how they're going to remodel the gardens." "When do we move?" Sarah asked. Rachel looked back at the gilded gates of the cemetery. "The formal reading of the will is in exactly 48 hours. Mr. Patterson has already sent the invitations to their inner circle. They think they're going there to collect a check." She stepped into the waiting car, her eyes hard and focused. The countdown had begun. In 2 days, the facade would crumble. In 2 days, the waitress would become the landlord. 48 hours, until the Winters family found out that the ground they were standing on had already been sold out from under them. The following afternoon, the air in Mr. Patterson's office felt thick with the scent of beeswax and ancient law books. Rachel Winters sat in a high-backed leather chair, her fingers tracing the embossed seal on a thick, cream-colored folder. It was a heavy, tactile weight that felt more like a weapon than a collection of documents. Mr. Patterson leaned across his mahogany desk, his expression a mixture of professional gravity and secret satisfaction. He adjusted his glasses, the light reflecting off the silver frames. "Everything is finalized, Rachel. The title transfer wasn't part of the will. It was executed through the holding company your grandmother established 3 years ago. As of yesterday, you don't just inherit the Winters estate. You already own it." Rachel opened the folder. The texture of the deed was crisp and cold under her fingertips. She looked at the signature, Dorothy Winters, written in a sharp, defiant script. "And the accounts?" "Frozen to them, but wide open to you," he replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Your parents have been spending against a line of credit they assume will be cleared by the inheritance. They've already overextended by nearly $200,000 in anticipation of the funeral and their rebranding of the property. They're spending money that doesn't exist," she said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "They're spending your asterisk money," he corrected. "And they have no idea the well has already run dry." 2 hours later, Rachel stood outside the Gilded Lily, the city's most exclusive bistro. The scent of expensive lilies and roasted truffles drifted through the open terrace doors. She could hear her mother's voice before she even saw her, a sharp, trilling laugh that demanded the attention of every patron in the vicinity. Susan and Richard were seated at a center table, surrounded by David Winters and 2 of their most influential inner circle friends, the Sterlings. The table was cluttered with crystal flutes and a 3-tiered seafood tower that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. "There she is," Susan called out as Rachel approached. Her mother didn't rise. She simply draped a manicured hand over the back of her chair, her diamonds catching the afternoon sun. "Look at you, still wearing that same little department store blazer. Honestly, Rachel, we're going to have to hire you a stylist once the paperwork is finished. We can't have the daughter of the Winters estate looking like she's about to take someone's coat." Richard chuckled, swirling a glass of vintage Chardonnay. He didn't look up from his phone. "Leave her be, Susan. Some people are just comfortable in the service class. It's a temperament thing." The Sterlings exchanged a tight, uncomfortable look, but David laughed, leaning back in his chair. "She's just staying humble, Mom. Right, sis? Keeping that waitress energy alive for the memories." Rachel felt the familiar sting of their words, but today the bite was gone. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed her modest handbag on the table, the heavy folder inside pressing against the white linen. "I see you've already started celebrating," Rachel said, her voice remarkably steady. "Well, someone has to maintain the family image," Susan snapped, signaling a waiter with a sharp snap of her fingers. "The funeral was a success despite your muted presence. Now it's time to look forward. Richard has already spoken to the architects. We're tearing down that drafty west wing where Dorothy kept all that Victorian junk. It's going to be a glass-walled solarium." "A solarium," Rachel repeated. She felt a surge of pure, white-hot rage. That wing had been her grandmother's sanctuary, the only place in that house that ever felt like a home. "You're destroying her library." "It's an eyesore, Rachel," Richard said, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, devoid of any grief for the mother he had just buried. "The house needs to reflect us now, not a senile old woman's hoarding habits. We're signing the contract tomorrow morning." "We've already given the decorators a $50,000 retainer." "You shouldn't have done that," Rachel said quietly. Susan rolled her eyes, taking a long sip of her wine. "Oh, don't start with the sentimentality. You've always been so small-minded. That's why you were excluded, dear. You don't understand the scale of a legacy like this. You see a library, we see a $10 million increase in property value." "I understand scale perfectly," Rachel replied. She reached into her bag and touched the corner of the deed. The secret power of it hummed through her. "I just think you're being premature." "Premature," Susan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. She leaned in, her perfume, something heavy and suffocatingly expensive, filling the space between them. "The will reading is tomorrow. We are the only heirs that matter. You're lucky we're even letting you stay in that cramped little apartment we pay for. If you keep up this attitude, we might just decide you need to find your own way in the world entirely. No more handouts. No more Winters safety net." Rachel looked at the Sterlings, who were watching the exchange with the morbid curiosity of people witnessing a car crash. Then she looked at David, who was busy photographing the wine label for his social media. "You're right, Mother," Rachel said, her voice like ice. "Tomorrow is going to change everything. I hope you've enjoyed the wine." She stood up before they could respond. The sound of her chair scraping against the stone patio was the only disruption to their gilded bubble. "Where are you going?" Richard demanded. "We haven't finished discussing the guest list for the estate gala." "I have an appointment with Sarah," Rachel said, turning to leave. "We have some final preparations to make for the reading." "Final preparations?" Susan sneered at her back. "What, are you going to polish your shoes? Don't bother. Nobody's going to be looking at you anyway." Rachel didn't look back. She walked out of the bistro, her heart hammering a steady, rhythmic beat against her ribs. She pulled out her phone and sent a one-word text to Sarah and Mr. Patterson. "Ready." The countdown was no longer a threat. It was a promise. In less than 24 hours, the architects would be canceled, the retainers would be forfeit, and the service class daughter would be the only person with the power to show them the door. Rachel stepped into the crowded street, the weight of the deed in her bag feeling lighter with every step. The Winters family thought they were standing on a mountain of gold, never realizing the ground had already been sold out from under them. The day before the memorial service, the air inside the Winters estate felt thick with the suffocating scent of expensive floor wax and white lilies. Rachel Winters stood in the grand foyer, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool mahogany of the banister. She had come to collect the final piece of her grandmother's legacy, the personal journals Grandma Dorothy had kept hidden in the library for decades. Susan appeared at the top of the stairs, her silk robe billowing like a cloud of misplaced elegance. She looked down at Rachel with a thin, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Still hovering, Rachel. I thought you'd be halfway back to your little apartment by now. There's really no need for you to be at the reading tomorrow. It'll just be awkward for everyone involved." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Rachel said, her voice steady. She felt the heavy brass key in her pocket, a cold, jagged weight against her thigh. It was the key to the wall safe she had discovered only days ago. Susan let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Suit yourself. Just don't expect a seat at the front. Richard and I have already arranged the seating for the important family members. We can't have the estate lawyers thinking we're a disorganized mess." Richard stepped out of the study, the distinct aroma of expensive scotch and old leather trailing behind him. He didn't even look at Rachel as he adjusted his heavy gold cufflinks, his movements practiced and arrogant. "Let her stay, Susan. It's good for her to see what she's missed out on. Maybe witnessing the official transfer of the estate will finally motivate her to do something with her life instead of drawing logos for local bakeries." Rachel watched them. They were so certain of their victory, so insulated by the walls of a house they didn't realize they no longer possessed. "You know, Richard," she said softly, "Grandma Dorothy always said that pride goes before a fall. You might want to double-check the fine print on those architectural plans you've been bragging about to the neighbors." Richard finally looked up, his eyes narrowing into slits. "What are you talking about? Those plans are finalized. The developers are coming in on Monday to begin the appraisal for the expansion." "I'm just suggesting caution," Rachel replied, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Sometimes the things we think we own are just borrowed time. You should probably have a backup plan, for everything." Susan scoffed, descending the stairs with a rhythmic, aggressive click-clack of her designer slippers. "Backup plan." "We are the plan, Rachel. We are the legacy. You're just a footnote she forgot to erase before she got too sick to hold a pen." A shadow moved in the hallway behind them. David Winters stepped into the light, looking every bit the golden child in his tailored navy suit. He tossed a smirk toward Rachel, one that held years of practiced superiority. "Don't mind her, Mom. She's just bitter because she's not getting the silver tea set. I'll make sure security knows to let her in tomorrow. We can't have the neighbors thinking we're cruel to the less fortunate branch of the family, can we?" The three of them stood there, a united front of entitlement and greed. Rachel felt a flicker of something that wasn't anger. It was a cold, sharp pity. They were standing on a trapdoor, and they were the ones who had greased the hinges with their own contempt. "I'll see you tomorrow," Rachel said, turning toward the heavy oak door. "Wear something black," Susan called out after her, "and try to look like you belong in a room with people who actually matter." Rachel didn't answer. She stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the journals tucked firmly under her arm. She drove straight to the small, quiet office of Mr. Patterson. The attorney was waiting for her, a single manila envelope sitting on his desk. "Everything is in order, Rachel," Mr. Patterson said, his voice grave but holding a hint of suppressed satisfaction. "The deed is registered in your name. The bank has already processed the freeze on the trust accounts associated with the house. The moment the will is read, the transfer becomes public record." Sarah was there too, leaning against the window sill. She looked at Rachel with a fierce, protective grin. The look on their faces is going to be worth every second of this. Rachel opened the journal to the last page. In Grandma Dorothy's elegant, looping script, one sentence stood out. "The truth is a fire. It only destroys what was meant to burn." "I'm ready," Rachel said. She looked at the clock on the wall. In less than 18 hours, the Winters family would find out that the house they were sleeping in didn't belong to them. The daughter they had dismissed as service class wasn't just a witness to their legacy. She was the one who had already signed its death warrant. The evening of the Winters Heritage Gala arrived with a chilling, artificial brilliance. Rows of amber lanterns lined the driveway of the estate, casting long, dancing shadows across the limestone facade that Rachel now technically owned. She stood at the edge of the manicured lawn, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool fabric of her charcoal silk gown. It was a far cry from the off-the-rack polyester she usually wore to family functions. The service class, uniform Susan always insisted was appropriate for a girl of her modest means. Tonight, however, the weight of the house keys in her velvet clutch felt like a loaded weapon. She took a breath, the scent of blooming gardenias, Grandma Dorothy's favorite, filling her lungs. The fragrance was overwhelming, almost cloying, competing with the expensive cigars being smoked by men in tuxedos on the terrace. Rachel stepped toward the grand entrance, the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels on the stone steps sounding like a countdown. "There you are!" A voice sharp as a blade cut through the ambient hum of the string quartet. Susan stood in the foyer, draped in navy sequins that caught the light with every judgmental breath she took. She didn't offer a hug or a greeting. Instead, she reached out and caught a lock of Rachel's hair between two manicured fingers, her lip curling in a practiced sneer. "I suppose you think that dress makes you look like you belong here. It's a valiant effort, Rachel, but everyone can see the desperation in the seams. Did you put it on a payment plan? Or did you finally dip into your meager savings just to play dress-up for one night?" Rachel didn't flinch. She met her mother's gaze with a calm that seemed to unsettle the older woman. "I thought it was important to look the part tonight, Susan. After all, it's a big night for the family. It's a big night for the people who matter," Susan snapped, leaning in so close that Rachel could smell the expensive, oaky Chardonnay on her breath. "Try to stay near the buffet. The caterers might need help clearing plates later, and it's the only way you'll actually be useful. Don't embarrass us by trying to mingle with the board members." She turned on her heel without waiting for a response, her sequins shimmering like scales. Rachel watched her go, a small, cold smile touching her lips. She reached into her clutch, her thumb brushing the embossed seal on the legal documents tucked inside. The wait was almost over. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with the sound of Waterford crystal clinking and the low, self-important murmur of the city's elite. Richard was at the center of the room, holding court near the fireplace. He looked every bit the master of the manor, his chest puffed out as he gestured toward the oil paintings on the wall, paintings that Grandma Dorothy had explicitly left to Rachel. "And of course," Richard's voice boomed, carrying over the music as he addressed a small circle of investors, "we'll be converting the East Garden into a private helipad and guest wing. It's high time this estate reflected the current standing of the Winters name. The old woman had a sentimentality for roses and dirt that simply doesn't align with a modern legacy." A collective chuckle rose from the group. David stood at his father's elbow, nodding vigorously, a glass of amber scotch in his hand. He caught Rachel's eye and raised his glass, not in a toast, but in a mocking salute. He leaned toward a young woman standing next to him, whispering something that made her giggle and cast a pitying glance in Rachel's direction. "The dead branches have to be pruned for the tree to grow," Richard continued, his eyes finally landing on Rachel with a look of profound dismissal. "Some people are anchors, dragging down the value of the family brand. But tonight, we move past the clutter of the past." Rachel felt a hand on her arm. She turned to see Sarah, looking radiant in a simple black dress, her eyes flashing with a protective fire. "I heard him," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with indignation. "He's talking about Grandma's garden like it's a trash heap. How are you standing here so calmly?" "Because he's talking about a house he doesn't own," Rachel replied, her voice low and steady. "He's making promises to investors using collateral that vanished the moment the sun went down." "Patterson is here," Sarah said, nodding toward the entrance. The attorney moved through the crowd like a shadow, his expression unreadable. He didn't head for the bar or the buffet. Instead, he made a direct line for the small dais where a microphone had been set up for the evening's announcements. He caught Rachel's eye and gave a singular, sharp nod. The bank accounts were frozen. The locks were scheduled for change. The trap was fully set. Rachel checked her watch. It was 8:55 p.m. In 5 minutes, Richard would take the stage to announce his vision for the future. He would stand before the most influential people in the state and brag about a fortune that had already been stripped from his grasp. She moved through the crowd, navigating the sea of silk and ego until she was standing just a few feet from the stage. She could see the sweat on Richard's brow, the glint of greed in David's eyes, and the smug, triumphant set of Susan's shoulders. They were at their peak, convinced of their untouchability, basking in the glow of a legacy they had done nothing to earn. Richard stepped up to the microphone, the feedback creating a sharp, piercing ring that silenced the room. He cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. "Friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests," he began, his voice dripping with an unearned authority. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just a house. We celebrate the transition of power. We celebrate the Winters legacy, finally being placed in the hands of those who know how to wield it." He looked directly at Rachel, a cruel, victorious glint in his eyes. "And before we begin the formal reading of the intent, I want to make one thing very clear to everyone in this room. Success isn't just about blood, it's about merit, and some people simply don't have what it takes to carry the weight of a name like ours." The room was deathly silent. Rachel felt the weight of 100 gazes, some curious, some pitying, most indifferent. She didn't look away. She didn't blush. She simply waited as Richard reached for the heavy, cream-colored envelope the estate executor had placed on the lectern. "It's time to open the future," Richard said, his fingers sliding under the wax seal. Rachel felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the soaring, electric hum of justice. She saw Mr. Patterson step forward into the light of the chandeliers, a secondary folder in his hand, the one with the gold-embossed seal of the State Records Office. "Wait," Rachel said, her voice not loud, but possessing a clarity that stopped Richard's hand mid-motion. The silence in the ballroom shifted from expectant to electric. Richard froze, the envelope half-torn, his face contorting into a mask of pure, indignant rage. "Rachel, get back to the corner. This is for the family." "I agree," Rachel said, stepping into the center of the floor, the light catching the charcoal silk of her dress until she seemed to glow against the darkness of the room. "It is for the family, which is why you should probably read the deed before you finish that speech." The silence in the ballroom was no longer expectant. It was suffocating. Richard Winters stood at the center of the gilded stage, the wax-sealed envelope trembling in his grip. He stared at Rachel as if she were a ghost, his face contorting into a mask of indignant fury that had served him well for decades. "You have no standing here," he spat, the words catching in his throat. "This is a private family matter, and you were never part of the plan." Susan stepped toward her husband, her perfume, a heavy, cloying scent of lilies and artificial prestige, trailing behind her like a shroud. She didn't look at her daughter, she looked through her. "Rachel, go home. You're making a scene in front of the board. Have you no shame?" Rachel didn't flinch. She felt the icy, smooth texture of her charcoal silk dress against her skin, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from her parents' rage. "I'm not making a scene, Susan," she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs of the 300 guests. "I'm providing clarity. Mr. Patterson, if you please." The attorney stepped forward, the dry, skeletal rustle of the parchment deed in his hand echoing through the sound system. He didn't look at the couple with the usual deference. He looked at them with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon about to remove a tumor. "Actually," Mr. Patterson said, his voice amplified by the lapel mic, "there is a slight correction to the estate's distribution. Grandma Dorothy didn't just leave a will. She executed a living trust 3 years ago." Richard's hand froze. He finally tore the envelope, but the paper inside wasn't a bank statement or a deed of gift to him. It was a single, typed page on the law firm's letterhead. As he read the first 3 lines, his face underwent a violent transformation. The arrogant flush of victory drained away, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor that made him look 20 years older in an instant. His eyes, once sharp with condescension, bulged behind his glasses, darting frantically across the legal text as his brain refused to process the words. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch uncontrollably, a rhythmic pulsing of pure, unadulterated terror. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling as a thin sheen of sweat broke out across his forehead, glistening under the crystalline light of the chandeliers. He looked like a man watching his own execution from the front row. "What is it?" Susan demanded, snatching the paper from his limp fingers. Her eyes scanned the page, and for the first time in Rachel's life, she saw her mother's composure shatter. The paper fluttered to the marble floor. The metallic ozone scent of the ballroom's overtaxed air conditioning seemed to sharpen as the crowd leaned in. David Winters stood near the buffet, his champagne glass tilted so far that the golden liquid began to drip onto his designer shoes, unnoticed. Sarah stood by Rachel's side, her chin tilted up, a silent witness to the carnage. "The estate, the holdings, and this very ballroom," Mr. Patterson announced to the room, "were never part of the Winters family trust. They were held in a private corporation. As of the passing of Grandma Dorothy, the sole owner of that corporation, and by extension this house, is Rachel Winters." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Two board members at the front table immediately stood up, distancing themselves from Richard as if his failure were contagious. One of them, a man who had laughed at Rachel's modest car only an hour earlier, suddenly looked very interested in his shoes. Richard tried to speak, but only a dry, wheezing sound emerged. He looked down at the floor, at the paper he had been so desperate to open, now lying in the dust of his own making. He reached out to steady himself against the podium, but his hand slipped. Rachel stepped closer, her shadow falling over the document. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply met his hollow gaze with the eyes of someone who had finally stopped waiting for permission to exist. "You spent 20 years telling me I didn't belong in this family," Rachel said, her words slicing through the heavy air. "You were right. I don't belong in a house built on lies. And since I'm the one who owns the deed, you have until noon tomorrow to find a house where you do belong." She turned on her heel, the silk of her dress whispering against the floor. She didn't wait for his rebuttal. She didn't wait for Susan's tears. She walked toward the grand oak doors, Sarah following close behind, leaving the silence of the ballroom to swallow the remains of her father's pride. The silence that followed Rachel's departure was a physical weight, a cold pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the grand ballroom. Richard Winters remained anchored to the spot where he had nearly collapsed, his hand still white-knuckled against the mahogany podium. He looked down at the deed Rachel had dropped, the heavy parchment mocking him from the floor. His face, usually a mask of tanned, calculated arrogance, began to disintegrate in slow motion. The ruddy color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, grayish pallor that made him look 20 years older in an instant. A muscle beneath his left eye began to twitch rhythmically, a frantic pulse against skin that had gone slack. His lower lip hung slightly open, trembling as if trying to form a word that his brain could no longer find. The sweat began to bead at his hairline, shimmering under the crystal chandeliers as his shoulders slumped, the expensive tailoring of his suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man watching his own execution from the front row. "Richard," Susan's voice was a thin, jagged glass shard. She looked around the room, her eyes darting toward the guests who were now backing away from their table as if the Winters name had become contagious. "Richard, pick that up. It's a mistake. It's some pathetic forgery she made in her little studio." She turned to the nearest witness, Mrs. Sterling, a woman who had spent the last decade competing for Susan's favor. Mrs. Sterling didn't offer a hand or a comforting word. Instead, she tightened her grip on her pearls and took a deliberate step back, her expression shifting from shock to a cold, clinical disdain. "I think we should go, Arthur," Mrs. Sterling whispered to her husband, her voice carrying easily in the hushed room. "I told you there was something off about the finances here." The sound of chair legs scraping against the marble floor echoed like gunshots. One by one, the people who had spent the evening praising Richard and Susan began to melt toward the exits. The scent of expensive lilies and aged scotch, which had felt like the aroma of success an hour ago, now hung in the air like the cloying smell of a funeral. "Wait!" Susan cried, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill pitch. "The dessert course hasn't even been served. We have the announcement." "The announcement has been made, Susan," a calm, resonant voice interrupted. Mr. Patterson stepped forward from the shadows of the buffet line. He didn't look like a man at a party. He looked like a man in a courtroom. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a second folder, identical to the one Rachel had carried. He didn't hand it to Richard. He placed it squarely on the podium, right over the microphone. "Everything is in order," Mr. Patterson said, his voice amplified by the speakers so that every departing guest heard the finality of it. "The transfer was executed 3 months ago. The estate, the holdings, and the primary residence were all under Dorothy's sole discretion. She left a very specific set of instructions regarding your stewardship." David Winters, who had been standing frozen by the champagne fountain, finally found his voice. "This is insane. I'm the son. I'm the one who ran the firm while she sat in that nursing home. You're telling me Rachel owns my house?" Mr. Patterson turned his gaze toward the golden sun. "Technically, David, she owns the ground you're standing on. And as for the firm, I'd suggest you check your email. The board was notified of the ownership change at the same time the deed was filed." The color left David's face as he fumbled for his phone. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow sound of Susan's heels as she paced a small, frantic circle. "She can't do this," Richard finally croaked, his voice sounding like dry leaves. He looked up at Mr. Patterson, a desperate, ugly spark of the old bully returning to his eyes. "She's my daughter. I'll sue. I'll tie her up in court until she's gray. I'll tell the papers she's a thief." "You could try," Mr. Patterson said, a small, dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But Rachel has the forensic audits from the last 5 years, Richard. She knows exactly where the missing maintenance funds for Dorothy's care actually went. I believe the term the district attorney uses is elderly financial abuse." Richard's knees finally gave out. He sank into the velvet-backed chair behind him, the very chair he had used as a throne all evening. Outside in the foyer, the air was cooler, smelling of the damp earth from a passing rain shower. Rachel stood by the heavy oak doors, Sarah at her side. She wasn't celebrating. She was simply breathing, her hand resting on the cold brass handle of the exit. The doors burst open behind them. Richard stumbled out, followed by a sobbing Susan. Richard's tie was crooked, his hair disheveled, the mask of the perfect father completely shattered. "Rachel!" he hissed, reaching out as if to grab her arm before Sarah stepped between them. "You listen to me. You're going to fix this. You're going to call that lawyer and tell him it was a joke. Think about the family. Think about what people will say." Rachel turned slowly. She looked at the man who had spent 20 years making her feel like a footnote in her own life. She looked at the woman who had poured wine on her dress just to see her flinch. "I am thinking about what people will say," Rachel said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "They're going to say that the Winters family finally got exactly what they deserved. And Richard, you're right about one thing. You don't belong in a house built on lies." "You ungrateful little," Susan started, her hand rising as if to strike. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't move an inch. "I've already changed the security codes for the main gate. The sheriff will be at the front door at noon tomorrow to supervise your departure. I suggest you start packing the things you actually paid for, though looking at the audit, that might not take you very long." She turned her back on them, the sound of her own heels crisp and certain on the stone steps. "Rachel!" Richard screamed after her, his voice cracking with a desperation that echoed off the stone walls of the estate he no longer owned. "Where are we supposed to go?" Rachel paused at the door of the waiting car, the interior light casting a soft glow over her face. She looked back at the sprawling mansion, the lights flickering as the guests fled the sinking ship. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," she said. "After all, you've always told me that people of your status always find a way to the top." She slid into the seat, and as the car pulled away, she didn't look back at the two figures standing in the shadows of the porch. She pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from her purse and drew a single, clean line through the first name on her list. 2 names remained. As the car reached the end of the long, winding driveway, Sarah looked over at her. What now? Rachel watched the iron gates swing shut in the rearview mirror. Now, she said softly, we go to the office. David still thinks he has a job tomorrow morning. 6 months had passed since the iron gates of the estate had swung shut on the only life Susan and Richard Winters had ever known. The scandal had been a localized wildfire, leaping from the social columns to the financial news, leaving nothing but charred reputations and empty bank accounts in its wake. Rachel Winters stood on the wraparound porch of the renovated manor, the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth replacing the cloying, artificial lilies her mother used to insist upon. The air felt lighter now, scrubbed clean of the tension that had defined her childhood. She adjusted her glasses, looking over the blueprints for the Dorothy Mercer Arts Foundation. The house was no longer a monument to exclusion. It was becoming a sanctuary for young creators who, like her, had been told they didn't belong. Sarah walked out from the foyer, 2 mugs of coffee steaming in the crisp morning air. The ceramic was warm against Rachel's palms, a grounding weight. "Patterson called," Sarah said, leaning against the white-painted railing. Her voice was gentle, knowing the weight the names still carried. "The final liquidation of your parents' remaining assets is complete. After the legal fees and the restitution for the funds they diverted from the estate over the years, there wasn't much left. They've officially moved into that rental in Oak Creek." Rachel took a sip of the coffee, the bitter warmth steadying her. Oak Creek was a 40-minute drive and a world away. It was a place of beige siding and cracked pavements, a far cry from the marble and gold Susan had treated as a divine birthright. 2 weeks later, Rachel found herself in that part of town for a site visit. She hadn't intended to seek them out, but a stop for fuel at a weathered station put her directly in the path of the ghosts she had exorcised. She saw a familiar, hunched figure, struggling with a heavy bag of groceries, near a rusted sedan that whined with a high-pitched metallic protest as it tried to start. It was Susan. The designer silk was gone, replaced by a pilled polyester coat that looked 2 sizes too large and smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and cheap detergent. Her hair, once a masterpiece of expensive highlights and weekly blowouts, was a dull, uneven gray at the roots. When she looked up and caught her daughter's gaze, the flash of recognition wasn't filled with motherly warmth, but a jagged, desperate bitterness. "Are you here to gloat?" Susan's voice was thin, raspy from a winter cold she couldn't seem to shake. She clutched her imitation leather purse to her chest like a shield, her knuckles red and chapped from the cold. "To see how the mighty have fallen. I hope you're satisfied, Rachel. We're living in a box while you play queen in a dead woman's house." Rachel didn't feel the surge of anger she expected. She didn't feel the need to twist the knife or recount the years of being left out in the cold. She simply felt a profound, hollow pity. "I'm just buying gas," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremors that used to define her. She noticed David sitting in the passenger seat of the car, his face buried in his phone, his shoulders slumped. He looked smaller, the golden child glow extinguished by the harsh reality of the warehouse job Mr. Patterson had helped him secure. The only place that would take him after the Winters name became toxic. Richard was nowhere to be seen. Rumors said he spent his days in the local library, reading old newspapers, and pretending he still had a board to chair. "You destroyed this family," Susan hissed, her eyes darting around to see if any of the locals recognized her. The paranoia of the fallen socialite was a heavy, suffocating shroud. "Your own blood. You destroyed this family the moment you decided that status was more important than your daughter," Rachel replied. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The silence that followed was the heaviest consequence of all. She reached into her car, pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope, and set it on the hood of the rusted sedan. It wasn't a peace offering. It was a final act of the grace they had never shown her. Grandma Dorothy wanted you to have a roof over your heads. This is the deed to her old cottage in the valley. It's small, but it's paid for. Consider it your final inheritance. Susan looked at the envelope as if it were a coiled snake. Her pride fought with her desperation for a long, agonizing minute before her hand shot out to snatch it. There was no thank you. There was only the sound of the engine finally catching, a dying cough of black smoke as they pulled away. Rachel watched the car shrink in her rearview mirror. She had won the house, the fortune, and her dignity, but the cost was a family tree with severed roots. She was a woman standing alone, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't lonely. Back at the estate, she sat in Grandma Dorothy's old study. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax. She picked up the leather-bound notebook from her desk and looked at the names. Her parents were gone. David was a stranger. She picked up a pen and, with a hand that didn't shake, drew a final, clean line through the last of the past. The new tradition wasn't about what you owned, but who you kept beside you. She looked out the window as the sun set, the iron gate standing wide open, welcoming the first group of scholarship students to the house that had finally, after all these years, become a home.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.